The moon ocean of Mirek IV was built to perform. Tides pulsed on a schedule, currents braided like choreography, and storms arrived only when invited by a switch on a gilded console. From the royal barge, Prince Zelor liked to watch the water writhe for him. Blue silk frothed to white by whisper commands, danger curated into spectacle. Tonight the choreography misfired. A siren climbed the length of the throne deck, thin at first, then raw. Hydraulics groaned. The practice dome, an arena of reinforced glass sunk just offshore, filled wrong, a wall of water punching through its floodgates with the idiot certainty of gravity. Below the surface, a pale, massive shape slammed the pane and slid, claws bright as grapnels, eyes blown to discs by panic. Pressure fault, someone said into a collar mic that didn't dare amplify fear. The regulators doubled intake. It will clear, Zelor replied, dismissing the fault with a flick of two lacquered fingers. The prince's retainers watched his mouth for cues the way farmers watch the sky. Stand down. It's your Varian Highness, a braver voice tried, almost a whisper. It's still chained for the drill. The prince didn't bother to follow the pointing hand. He could see well enough. The lion beast, bred for warfields and pageantry, a continent of muscle wrapped in iridescent mane, was drowning, tied to a floor designed to prove how tame it was. A paw the size of a man's chest rose, sheared froth, fell short of air. The chain that leashed its throat to the anchor socket glinted once and vanished into bubbles. Zelor sighed the way he had been taught to sigh when servants broke plates. It failed training, he said, cuffing a dark smear of blood from his sleeve where a fang had snagged him earlier. I am not sentimental about failures. On the command catwalk, hands froze inches from emergency levers. Protocol demanded a flood reversal and a rescue team. Protocol had been written by people who died for less. The prince turned away from the glass and touched the rail as if verifying it was real. Around him, the court shifted into a better viewing angle for the end of something. A human broke formation. Darren Miles wasn't on anyone's roster of important men. He wore Terran field armor in a ship that preferred robes and medals. He kept inventory for a med bay no one admitted needing. He had the unhelpful habit of listening for alarms that didn't belong to his species. He heard this one and moved before his brain caught up. Boots splitting the neat line of retainers like a thrown stone parting birds. You will do nothing, Zelor said without raising his voice, because he had never needed to. The sentence slid over the deck like oil. Darren didn't answer. He was already running. He hit the gantry at a slide, banged one hip against a guard post hard enough to color the bone, and ripped at his suit seals with his teeth as he sprinted. The suit always felt too big in hallways. Now it felt too small, a second skin that couldn't enlarge fast enough to hold everything his body insisted on doing. He grabbed a shock spear from a rack and a med kit from a bewildered tech, clipped them wrong, and kept moving. The air outside the dome's emergency hatch was hot with friction, storm steam and machine breath mingling into a metallic thunder. Through the warped glass he saw an eye, green rimmed with bioluminescent blue, roll white and disappear below a froth stamped with the shape of the chain. He slammed the manual override, wrenched the hatch wheel until a tendon in his forearm sang, and shoved past the last arm that tried to keep him suited to the dry world. He dove. Water hit like a dropped wall. Sound became pressure. Light turned to knives. Above him the royal barge floated on its reflections. Below him a mass the size of a small shuttle lunged and fell, the chain popping taut at full extension and sawing the beast's neck in a new line of red. Darren kicked, helmet light stuttering into green haze and then back to black. A moment's drift brought him into the lion's orbit, and everything in him that could be afraid became useful instead. He caught the chain with one hand and the lion's jaw with the other. The lion's throat rumbled once against his palm, reflex, memory of a roar. Then nothing. Darren shoved a gloved knuckle up under the jaw, feeling for the notch where bone turned to ligament. He found the shackle valve blindly and thumbed open the emergency cavity in his wrist gauntlet at the same time. A surgical spike clinked into his fingers, the one tool in the galaxy designed to know the difference between a bolt and a pulse. He stabbed upward, metal into metal, and felt the shackle resist like a locked door you know opens this way because there is no other way. The spike snapped. The shackle didn't. His lungs started a new clock. He wrapped the chain once around his forearm and braced his boots against the anchor socket. He pulled. The chain bit deep, and his suit started bleeding at the elbow. The beast twitched and went frighteningly loose against him, the way bodies surrender to deeper currents than choice. He put his helmet to the slope of skull and spoke. No translator, no science, just heat and sound into bone. You're not dying here. Breathe, you bastard. Breathe for me. Up on the throne deck, somebody finally remembered to pray. Darren knew the numbers. Oxygen remaining, not enough. Depth, deep enough to make the world heavier. Leverage, a rumor a human tells himself when he is smaller than the problem. He ignored the math and built a different equation. Hand, spike, valve, heart. He fumbled a second spike from the gauntlet sheath with fingers that had discovered their own tremor. The lion's pupils drifted, blew wide, drifted again. Gills, vestigial in this breed, never meant for water this cold or this fast, fluttered uselessly. Darren jammed the spike into the shackle seam, found purchase, and torqued his wrist until his forearm wanted to become a different shape. The seam jumped. Water punched into the mechanism and stuttered the lock. The chain slackened a breath. He didn't wait for the second breath. He shoved his shoulder under the lion's jaw and drove upward, a man trying to move a cliff with the fulcrum of his own ridiculous certainty. The chain grated, gave another inch, then another. Above, through a confused rain of bubbles, light fractured into ribbons that looked like promises if you were willing to be lied to. His chest burned in long, serrated lines. He willed his body to steal slow sips through lips already fighting the water back. He had done this before, on Terran rivers choked with spring thaw, in the flooded guts of ships after bad landings. He had been smaller than despair every time. He had learned to be meaner than it. The lion's forepaw rose, hung, and fell across his back, not crushing, not kind, merely there. Weight. Heat. A map of claw scar and old battles. The chain finally spat the last of its argument and slithered off the anchor socket, and suddenly everything that had been held down was not. They shot up. It wasn't elegant. There is nothing elegant about a human welded by will to a drowning, world-ending machine of muscle. It was an ugly eruption of need. Darren hooked both hands into the lion's mane, the bioluminescent filaments slick under his gloves, and kicked until his hips felt hollow. The lion's body did the work it had been made to do long before collars and princes shaped its days. It swam. Raggedly. Badly. But it helped. He tore the stim injector free with his teeth and spit the cap into the ocean. He found the notch at the base of the throat where fur thinned and skin learned to stretch. He plunged the needle in and thumbed the plunger. A chemical sunrise burned through his glove and into someone else's morning. The lion's chest lurched, then locked, then hit a rhythm that could have been life. They broke the surface together like an answer finally kicking down the last door of an old house. Air slammed him. He coughed a lung into the sky, swallowed the rest, and dragged another mouthful down by its hair. The storm had moved on to rage elsewhere. Here the rain hissed on the dome's cracked glass and turned the whole world into a lens. Hook, he tried to shout, and it came out like a warthog dreaming of letters. He waved an arm for the med canopy that had drifted into range and saw rifles, hands, a prince's coat, everything blurred by water, pivot toward him. On me, a voice answered, blessedly not the prince's. A rescue crew, finally permitted to be decent. Lines arced over his head. One landed across the lion's shoulder. Another skipped and slapped his helmet. He grabbed both, clipped the lion's line into his harness because he didn't trust anyone else's idea of secure, and then let the canopy win. They surfed a last bad wave and slammed into the skimmer deck hard enough to throw sparks. Darren's knees buckled, and he kept them from knowing by refusing to be in them. The lion's head thudded into the rubberized mat and didn't move. Everything that could still take orders in his body went to the beast first. He tore his glove with his teeth and set the heel of his bare hand on the sternum plate that armor and myth had grown over muscle. He counted in a Terran cadence and pressed. Nothing. He pressed harder, leaning his whole weight into it, hearing, absurdly, the wet squeak of mane against mat and the obscene romance of air, wanting to leave anything but this. He pinched the great mouth open, sealed his lips over a muzzle that could bite through alloy, and gave what the ocean had just given back to him. Breathe, he said into the lion's teeth, Water and salt, and someone else's blood, making a new liturgy on his tongue. Breathe, you magnificent problem. A cough ripped through the beast, as if something inside had remembered its own to-do list. Water geysered, then streamed, then came in a more shameful trickle. The ribs hit a rhythm that wasn't grace but could be improved with practice. A shudder walked the length of the lion's spine and ended with a rasp that wanted to be a sound and failed. Get back! A guard barked, because he had finally arrived where the human already was. Darren didn't move. He set his hand on the lion's cheek, thumb at the hinge of the jaw, feeling for the small trembling that means a pulse is considering being honest. The eye opened, half, then more, and found him. Not the prince, not the rifles, him. For an electric second that made the deck seem very, very small, the two of them recognized each other as the only things in the universe that mattered enough to be stubborn about. On the throne deck above, the courtiers had gone rigid as statues asked to perform thought. Zalor stood where he had started, back to the rail, hands as empty as they had been when he let the chain have its way. Darren dragged in another breath that cut and didn't care. Under Terran medical authority, he rasped, voice raw and carrying, a thing learned on battlefields where orders needed to be louder than fear. This patient is stabilized and protected. Rifles hesitated. Authority knew itself when it heard its own timbre, even if the uniform wearing it wasn't the one you expected. The lion exhaled, a long, low, obscene sound somewhere between a groan and the first vowel in a baby's vocabulary. It shuddered again, and God help them all, tried to tuck its massive head into the crook of his hip like a creature seeking a smaller world to survive in. Good, Darren said, because sometimes the right word is the smallest one within reach. Good boy, stay. They put the beast where triumphs go to be forgotten, a glass cylinder sunk into the throne deck like a trophy case, steel ribs webbing its circumference, medlines fed through with the caution reserved for explosives. Floodwater steamed off its main in slow curtains. The deck crews called it containment. Darren called it a room that didn't know how to be kind. He wasn't allowed inside. They set a boundary a single boot length from the glass and told him to stay behind it. He sat anyway, knees up back against a column, helmet beside him like a discarded moon. Someone had left towels. He used them to keep the lion warm where heat lamps couldn't reach the muscle under armor. Someone had left a nutrition manifold. He recalibrated it by ear. A field trick stolen from too many nights coaxing shattered lungs to remember rhythm. Every now and then the beast's chest stalled. Every time, Darren's hand found the notch at the jaw hinge and pressed until breath argued itself back into motion. The court came in waves. Retainers first, whispering like rain on a tin roof. Officers, their decorations uneasy with the smell of salt. Techs, pretending they were here for diagnostics, not the ache pulling them down this corridor. They watched the human murmur nonsense and steadiness into a muzzle built to end arguments, and they watched the monster not end him. Prince Zalor arrived when the hour had cooled enough to flatter mirrors. He brought guards who wore their fear like perfume and a voice that assumed the room was furniture. You disobeyed, he said, and turned the syllables into something ornamental. For a thing bred to crown my victories. Darren stood. The lion's eye, half-lidded and bright as a wet planet, followed the shift and stayed there. I didn't come for your victories, Darren said. I came for a pulse. It would have eaten you, Zalor replied, not as threat, as theorem. Darren's mouth tilted in something that wasn't quite a smile. It didn't. A vibration set the glass singing. Not a growl, deeper. The unvoiced chord of an animal deciding the shape of its world. The guards' rifles angled up as if answering gravity instead of orders. The prince's gaze flicked just once, to the creature's paw settling with exquisite care against the pane where Darren stood. He dismissed the assembly with a gesture designed to look magnanimous. The court dispersed in rustles and fragments. Cameras, authorized and otherwise, stayed. They captured the human dozing with his head on a rucksack, the lion's breath fogging the glass between them in slow ovals, the moment a great paw lifted and rested, nailless, against that fog as if testing the idea that touch could happen through barrier. By morning, the medtechs had stopped saying it. By afternoon, one of them slipped a name under her breath, Morrow, and the syllables fit. The beast's ear twitched when Darren used it. the way hearts lean into nicknames offered by people who have paid for the right to say them. The palace tried to starve tenderness out of the story. The feeds did the opposite. They looped a clip of a Varian lion lowering its head until a human could reach the scar under its left eye and lay a hand there without anything horrible happening. The galaxy watched and learned a new reflex. Protocol recovered its nerve at noon. A tribunal screen unfolded at the end of the hall, all carved precedent and ceremonial cruelty. The prince's seal burned along its edge. A clerk read charges that belonged to other eras: dereliction, insubordination, unlawful claim over royal property. The words tried to stick to Darren and slid off. "This animal jeopardized my command," Zalor said, not looking at the glass, only at the man in front of it. "You have made it a symbol. Symbols attract war. Symbols attract mirrors," Darren said, softer than prudence. "Look in one." A guard stepped forward too fast, the way a man reaches for a sliver and finds a blade in his hand. Morrow rose, not pouncing, not posturing, simply stood to his full terrible height, mane falling in wet banners, pupils narrowing to lit slits. The sound that followed began at the floor and climbed ribs and rafters before anyone knew it was a voice. It wasn't loud. Loud is easy. It was tuned. The kind of frequency that slides a decision out of a bone and replaces it with sense. The guard froze with his rifle half-born. Zalor's palm lifted, command catching up with fear. "Stand down," the prince said, and his tone betrayed him. Less order than request. Silence cracked, not with gunfire, with something stranger. The scuff of boots as soldiers turned their stances from attack to at ease, the chime of a med unit rediscovering calm respirations, the soft, ridiculous sound a giant cat makes when it decides a lap is a place, not a person. Morrow sank, pressed his vast skull to the base of the glass where Darren's knees touched it, and exhaled as if setting a weight down he had been bred to carry. The tribunal blustered into relevance and failed. Somewhere between clause and punishment, a different emergency spoke over the channel. A break in the convoy near Vesper 5, civilians pinned, pirates cutting comms with knives. The prince's eyes flickered the feed painting ruin into thin air. He hesitated, trapped between ceremony and need. Darren didn't. "Open it," he told the nearest tech, nodding toward the seal on the enclosure. She looked at her superior, then at a beast whose breath had just tuned the room, and chose the more honest authority. The lock hissed and turned. Glass lifted. Air, finally shared, smelled of salt and possibility. Morrow stepped out like a storm deciding to be infrastructure. The corridor shrank around him. He stopped at Darren's side, shoulder to hip, as if he had always been built to make a lane through a bad day for one specific human to walk. "What are you doing?" Zalor asked, too late and knowing it. "Medicine," Darren said. "Just a different kind." He slung a rifle across his back with one hand and set the other against the fur at Morrow's jaw. The lion's eyes flicked to him, then to the screen, then to the doors that led to ships. No neural leash, no spurs. A single word, the first of many, and they moved. The court parted like a wound, learning how to become a seam. Morrow did not snarl, he did not threaten. He passed within inches of rifles that had forgotten their lines, of senators who discovered their knees like the floor, of a prince who stood very still and watched a man and a monster walk away with something his crown could not command. At the doors, Darren paused and looked back. Not for permission, for the courtesy of clarity. "You left him to drown," he said. "He chose to live. Decide which part of that sentence belongs to you." The prince did not answer. The deck shuddered under the first thrumming lift of engines, heading toward a place where help had been asked for in uglier words. Morrow shook himself once, water casting off him in a halo that smelled like rain, and set his paws on a path that would make newsfeeds weep and children draw better futures in the margins of their work. On the throne deck, where storms were supposed to obey and spectacle was safety, the glass cylinder stood empty. The room felt larger without it. For the first time since the flood, the ocean below sounded like an ocean, not a script. And somewhere inside a chest that had been measured only by ceremony, a heartbeat admitted it had heard a roar that refused blood and found, embarrassingly, that it preferred that sound. Vesper V hung ahead like a lantern with a cracked pane. The convoy's distress beacons stuttered in sickly rhythms across the darkness. Ships pinned in a skein of grapples and cutter beams. Pirate craft, lean and ugly, threaded between cargo hulls the way knives slide between ribs. The royal frigates loitered at range, shackled by rules no one could remember writing. Darren hit the hangar deck at a run. Morrow hit it like gravity had been renegotiated in his favor. A shuttle crew stared as the Lion took the ramp in 2 strides and curled himself into the dropship's belly with tidy ferocity, tail thumping once against the bulkhead. No saddle, no bit. The only harness was Darren's hand fisted in mane and a single word spoken into an ear that had learned to translate intent. With. The dropship punched the lock and fell into the blue-black between. The pirate bands jammed comms halfway through their first threat. The windshield filled with the close geometry of disaster. Cables thrown like harpoons, cutters chewing through a civilian hull, and a cargo liner yawing toward a slow collision that would turn into a slow funeral. Darren keyed shipwide. Boarding teams are mine. No stray fire near civilians. We cut grapples, we break locks, we triage. Move. The pilot flicked a look back. You're not in charge here, and then saw Morrow's eyes, calm and cannily alive, peering down the ramp and decided command could wear very strange uniforms. They hit the first pirate corvette hard enough to make metal remember its mined origins. Morrow cleared the ramp in a leap that turned distance into an insult, landed on deck like a verdict, and didn't roar. He didn't need to. The air around him changed its mind. A marauder's shock baton skated off his shoulder and shattered against the bulkhead. Claws took the baton's argument away. Teeth did not. Darren came behind, rifle low, voice higher than gunmetal, down, hands. Crawl to the bulkhead. Now. The cadence that snaps people out of stupid decisions. He threw a triage wrap at a pulley operator bleeding from his ear and shoved a pressure pack against a rent in a civilian's suit while Morrow leaned 600 pounds of opinion against a gang boss who just discovered he believed in surrender. They moved ship to ship on maglines while the royal frigates, freed by example if not by memo, closed in. On a grain freighter, Darren shot through a lock, slid under a spar, and found 3 dock workers trapped under the coupler. He didn't look at the timer counting the coupler's failure. He looked at Morrow. Lift, he said. Morrow set his forepaws and pushed. Steel that had declined to negotiate with tools discovered it had a different opinion about fur. The coupler rose the width of a breath, then another. Darren dragged a man free by his collar, then a woman by her harness, then wedged a beam in with a boot while his shoulder learned a hymn to strain. The youngest was pinned at the hip. A kid whose face couldn't decide between terror and fury. Darren went still long enough for the kid to see where the air was, then cut the strap and pulled him into it. Morrow let the coupler down without letting it fall. The kid's eyes hit the Lion and filled with a belief that would outlive logic. They reached the convoy's spine, 2 tankers welded together by greed and bad engineering, where the pirates had set up a final theater. The board boss, armored in a suit plated with other people's last choices, lit a plasma saw and strode out onto the crossbar like a man rehearsing a legend. He swung for Morrow's face because some lessons must be expensive to be kept. The Lion didn't dodge. He turned his head, took the hit along the armor-thick ridge where nature cheats, and shouldered the man into the rail with an economy that made the crowd's breath go sharp. Darren shot the saw out of his hand because mercy requires both halves, averted catastrophe and a future that can stand trial. The whole time, feeds ran. The pirates streamed their own bravado until bravado learned shame. The convoy's black box cameras captured a Lion mapping a firefight into lanes of safe passage, a human medic kneeling in a spray of sparks to tape a wound closed with his own sleeve, a pairing that kept saying, stay, stay, stay in a universe that had learned too many ways to say leave. When the last grapple spat free and spun into dark, the convoy heaved like a chest unclamping. Civvies who'd been holding their breath because no one had told them to do otherwise finally let it go. In the distance, the royal frigate's shields flared as they took the return volleys meant for weaker hulls. On the flagship, a prince who had watched too many rehearsed wars moved his hand without waiting for a precedent and ordered that cover. Darren slumped against a bulkhead, gun slack, and felt Morrow's great head press once into his shoulder, like a congratulations administered with discretion. The Lion's breath ticked his hairline. The smell was metal, salt, and something he refused to name as affection because he had work to finish. "Med sweep," he said into his mic, which had no rank and all authority. "We're not done." They weren't. They walked the line, beast and human, through smoke and groan and thank yous said like apologies. Cameras caught the moment a grandmother patted Morrow's nose, and the moment Darren secretly fed the lion a strip of rationed jerky as if bribing a mountain. The galaxy made up its mind. It wasn't watching a pet-turned-weapon. It was watching a bond invent a better rulebook in real time. By the time the convoy turned homeward under armed escort and the last pirate beacon went dark, 1,000 screens were playing a clip that didn't need commentary. A Varian lion sitting like a statue carved to reassure, eyes on a human stitching a wound, tail thumping once when the stitch held. Back on the royal flagship, the doors to the throne room opened before Darren could reason himself out of walking through them. The court had dressed for blame. They wore law like armor, and opinion like perfume. Zellor sat on a seat calibrated to make lesser people smaller. He did not look larger. He looked like a man who had watched his reflection in too many polished surfaces and finally found a scratch he couldn't buff out. Darren walked to the center of the room with Morrow pacing at his knee. He didn't bow, he didn't spit, he stood. The lion sat, not because anyone told him to, but because stillness can be eloquent. "You used him to win what you were about to lose," Darren said. "Not accusation, inventory." "I deployed an asset," Zellor answered by habit, and the pronunciation of the last word broke under its own cowardice. "An asset you left to drown." The words didn't echo. They sank. The room waited for the explosion that power usually delivers when cornered. It didn't come. Zellor looked at Morrow. Really looked, as if a stranger had entered in the lion's skin and refused to be catalogued, and then at the feeds trembling on the chamber's edge. He saw the old, unflattering images looping in 1,000 homes, a chain vanishing into bubbles, a back turning. He saw the new ones, a human hauling a myth back from a bad idea, a beast refusing to be what it had been paid to be. "What do you want?" he asked, voice small in a room engineered for large. "Not your seat," Darren said, "your change." The list wasn't long, but it had edges. Floodworld protocols rewritten by engineers, not courtiers. Emergency authority to any medic, Terran or otherwise, when a life hangs between orders and oxygen. Sanctuary status for Varian and other bonded war creatures who choose their keepers back. And one selfish clause offered without apology, Morrow's freedom recognized in law, with the right to accompany, refuse, or return as he pleased. The courtier sputtered in the key of tradition. Zellor didn't. He stood, throne groaning at the lack of weight, and stepped down into the same plane as everyone else. For a moment he resembled the boy he must have been before crowns taught him that care is a weakness you outsource. He went to one knee. Gasps skittered around the room like startled birds. The prince bowed his head to the creature he had called an instrument, and to the man he had called a problem. "I am sorry," he said, "and it wasn't performance." The words landed with the dull, heavy sound of something true being said on the floor. Morrow blinked. The great head tilted. He leaned in and breathed across the bent crown with a gentleness that made the guards reconsider everything they had been told in training about categories. He touched his muzzle to Zellor's shoulder, not anointing, not forgiving, acknowledging that the apology had been heard. The room didn't know where to put its hands. Darren showed it. He reached down and pressed his palm to the prince's shoulder opposite the lion's touch, as if bracing a fracture while the bone learned to knit. "Then sign," he said. Zellor signed. He signed like a man eager to get his pen between himself and a past that had begun to itch. Statutes unfurled, seals bit digital paper, and the royal feeds pushed out a bulletin in language that didn't bother with poetry. Protocols amended, sanctuaries established, rights recognized. The galaxy did the thing it does when given a good story that also makes sense. It started copying. They didn't make a ceremony of the rest. Someone from the Dockmasters Guild brought up a bronze plaque that said, "Morrow's Gate," and no one could explain how it had been forged so quickly. It went up on the Flood Dome's rebuilt control tower anyway, crooked and perfect. The med staff requisitioned more field kits without waiting for a budget. A steward put a bowl of water down by the throne because this was now a room where living things would sometimes get thirsty. They left together through the doors that had learned a new idea of who qualified as honored. In the hangar, ground crews pretended to be busy so they could watch. Kids from the kitchens stood on crates and held breath until Morrow exhaled onto their hair and made them shriek with the joy of being noticed by something impossible. A senatorial aide who had once blocked medical shipments to look decisive found himself sliding a feeding tray under a jaw that could unmake him and discovering that service can be addictive. On the observation deck, the ocean of Merak 4 breathed on its schedule and then, shyly, on its own. Darren sat with his back to the rail and his legs out long. Morrow folded down beside him with the patient articulation of a bridge settling. The lion's head found his lap with the inevitability of tide. Darren's hands, which had been clever enough to steal the dying back from water, were stupidly soft now, rubbing the fur at the hinge of a jaw that had remodeled violence into guardianship. "You're staying?" a voice asked. Zaylor, standing at the threshold like a man waiting to see if he was welcome on a porch. "For a while," Darren said, "because forever is not a word a soldier should say out loud. There's training to be done." "To teach him?" The prince nodded at Morrow. "To teach you," Darren answered, and after a beat, smiled. "And anyone else who wants to learn how not to drown what loves them." The prince stepped closer, the ocean throwing a clean wind up into the space between three unlikely mammals. He didn't reach to touch, he reached to be within arm's length of change. Below, the tide turned without a switch. Above, a new law climbed the channels faster than gossip. Between, a human heartbeat settled into a tempo a lion had decided to keep. The flood world, built for spectacle, began to suspect it had been repurposed for sanctuary. And on a deck that had been designed to magnify the sound of a single man's voice, the most important thing anyone heard was quieter than policy. A purr, impossibly deep, like a world forgiving itself.